Go live with your old friends, Dad. This house is worth too much to waste on an old man. Those cruel words from my own son David still echo in my mind as I sit on the porch of what used to be my family home, watching him pack the last of his belongings into a moving truck. But today, 6 months after he kicked me out, I'm holding keys to every single house on Maple Street, including the one where I raised him for 40 years. The lottery ticket I bought with my last $20 didn't just change my bank account, it gave me the sweetest revenge a father could ask for. If you've ever been thrown away by your own children like yesterday's garbage, if you've ever watched ungrateful family members sell your memories for profit, pull up a chair, because this story is about how sometimes the universe has a sense of humor, and how an old man's broken heart can turn into an old man's perfect justice. And if you love tales about karma, family betrayal, and the kind of revenge that makes you smile for weeks, hit that subscribe button for Grandpa's Diaries. Trust me, this one's going to restore your faith in divine justice. At 68 years old, I'd lived in the same house on Maple Street for 4 decades, watching the neighborhood change from working-class families to young professionals with more money than sense. My wife Martha and I had raised David in that 3-bedroom bungalow, saved every penny to pay off the mortgage, and planned to spend our golden years surrounded by the memories we'd built room by room. But Martha passed last year from cancer, and apparently her death was David's opportunity to cash in on 40 years of our sweat equity. The conversation that changed everything happened 2 weeks after Martha's funeral, when the grief was still so fresh I could barely function. David, dressed in his expensive real estate agent suit, sat me down in the kitchen where Martha used to make Sunday breakfast and delivered his ultimatum with the cold efficiency of a business transaction. Dad, this neighborhood is gentrifying fast. This house could sell for $400,000, maybe more. You don't need all this space, and I could really use the commission and inheritance. I stared at my son, the boy I'd taught to throw a baseball in the backyard, whose college education I'd funded with overtime shifts at the garage, who used to promise he'd take care of me when I got old, and realized I was looking at a stranger. This is my home, David. Your mother and I built our life here. Her garden is still blooming in the backyard. But he just shrugged like 40 years of family history was an inconvenience blocking his financial goals. The eviction notice came disguised as concern for my welfare. Dad, you're getting older, and this house is too much for you to maintain. I found you a nice senior community across town where you can make new friends. What he meant was, I want you gone so I can sell this house and you can disappear into some anonymous facility where your needs won't interfere with my profit margins. When I refused to leave, his patience disappeared entirely. The final blow came on a Tuesday morning when David arrived with a locksmith and legal papers. I'm sorry it's come to this, Dad, but the house is being sold. You can stay with one of your old friends until you figure out your next move. He'd used my grief and vulnerability to manipulate me into signing papers I thought were insurance documents, but were actually transfer deeds giving him legal control of my home. By the time I understood what had happened, I was standing on the sidewalk with 2 suitcases, watching my son change the locks on the house where I'd lived longer than he'd been alive. Before David's betrayal destroyed everything, Maple Street was more than just an address. It was the foundation of a life Martha and I had built brick by brick, paycheck by paycheck. We bought that little bungalow in 1985 when David was just 2 years old, using my savings from 10 years of working double shifts at Murphy's Auto Repair and Martha's nest egg from her nursing job at Grady Hospital. The down payment represented every sacrifice we'd made, every vacation we'd skipped, every luxury we'd denied ourselves to give our son a stable home. Those early years were magic, filled with the kind of memories that make a house feel sacred. Martha planted her first garden that spring, teaching little David to water the tomatoes and pick strawberries for breakfast. I built him a treehouse in the old oak behind the garage, spending weekends sawing boards and hammering nails, while he handed me tools and asked endless questions about how things worked. Sunday mornings meant pancakes in our sunny kitchen. Afternoon meant teaching David to throw a football in our small backyard. And evenings meant sitting on the front porch watching our neighbors walk their dogs and children ride bicycles up and down our quiet street. David's childhood was anchored in that house in ways that should have made it impossible for him to sell. His height marks were still penciled on the doorframe of his bedroom closet, tracking his growth from age 3 to 18. The basement still held boxes of his school projects, Little League trophies, and the wooden Derby car we'd built together for Cub Scouts. Martha had preserved his bedroom exactly as he'd left it when he went to college, hoping he'd bring grandchildren to stay for holidays and summer visits. The neighborhood was our extended family during those golden years. Mrs. Eleanor Washington next door became Martha's closest friend. Their daily coffee talks spanning everything from raising children to managing household budgets. The Hernandez family across the street shared vegetables from their garden and invited us to their children's birthday parties. Mr. Pete, the retired postal worker 2 houses down, taught David to play chess on summer evenings. We weren't just homeowners. We were part of a community that cared about each other's welfare and celebrated each other's successes. Martha and I poured our hearts into that house, upgrading the kitchen when David started high school, finishing the basement when he brought college friends home for holidays, and landscaping the backyard for his graduation party. Every improvement was an investment in our family's future. Every project was completed with the assumption that this house would shelter us through retirement and eventually become David's inheritance. We never imagined our son would see our home as a commodity to be liquidated for quick profit. David's real estate career began during his last year of college, and initially we were proud of his ambition and success. He'd bring clients through the neighborhood, pointing out the solid construction of our house and the family-friendly atmosphere of Maple Street. "This is where I grew up," he'd tell potential buyers with what seemed like genuine affection. "These are the kind of homes and neighbors that create lasting memories." We thought his success meant he understood the value of community and family stability. But somewhere along the way, David's perspective shifted from appreciating home as sanctuary to evaluating property as investment opportunity. When Martha got sick, his visits became less frequent and his conversations more focused on the rising property values in our area than on his mother's health or his father's emotional needs. By the time Martha passed, David was looking at our home through the cold lens of market analysis rather than the warm filter of family history. The boy who'd grown up believing home was where love lived had become a man who saw home as where money waited to be harvested. The first warning sign that David had changed came during Martha's final months, when he started mentioning property values more often than asking about her treatment progress. While I was focused on making her comfortable and spending every possible moment by her side, David would visit and immediately start conversations about the neighborhood's impressive appreciation potential and how smart investors were moving into the area. His timing felt cruel, discussing profit margins while his mother fought for her life in the bedroom where she'd sung him lullabies. During Martha's last weeks, when she could barely speak above a whisper, David brought real estate magazines and market analysis reports to the hospital. "Dad, you should really think about the future," he'd say, while Martha dozed between pain medications. "This house is going to be worth serious money and you won't be able to maintain it alone." He was planning our home sale before his mother had even passed, calculating inheritance while I was calculating how many more days I had left with my wife of 45 years. The funeral became David's networking opportunity in ways that still make my stomach turn. Between the service and burial, he introduced himself to mourners as a local real estate professional and handed out business cards to neighbors who'd come to pay respects to Martha. Mrs. Washington later told me she'd overheard David telling someone that prime properties in established neighborhoods don't stay on the market long. He was prospecting for clients at his own mother's funeral. Within a week of Martha's burial, David started his campaign to convince me that staying in our family home was impractical and potentially dangerous for a man my age. He'd point out maintenance issues that needed attention, mention how big the house felt with just one person, and suggest that moving to a senior community would provide better social opportunities and healthcare access. Every conversation felt like a sales pitch designed to make me question my ability to live independently in the home I'd maintained successfully for decades. The pressure intensified when David started bringing potential buyers through the house under the pretense of helping Dad understand current market values. These weren't formal appraisals or friendly consultations. They were staged showings designed to demonstrate how much money was waiting to be harvested if I would just cooperate with his plan. Young couples would walk through Martha's kitchen making comments about updating the vintage fixtures and opening up these small rooms for better flow. David's patience with my resistance began wearing thin after about a month of my refusal to consider selling. His visits became more aggressive, his suggestions more demanding, and his tone more condescending. "Dad, you're being stubborn about this," he'd say, like my attachment to 40 years of memories was unreasonable behavior. You're sitting on $400,000 that could secure your future, and you're acting like an old man who doesn't understand modern economics. The breaking point came when I discovered David had been showing the house to real estate investors without my knowledge or permission. Mrs. Washington told me she'd seen strangers with measuring tapes and clipboards walking around our backyard, taking pictures and making notes. When I confronted David, he didn't deny it. Instead, he justified it as preparing for inevitable decisions you'll need to make soon. He'd been treating our family home like his personal inventory, available for sale as soon as he could convince or coerce me into compliance. That's when I realized my son had stopped seeing me as his father and started viewing me as an obstacle to his financial goals. The boy I'd raised to value family, community, and integrity had become a man who saw his grieving father as a problem to be solved and his childhood home as an asset to be liquidated. David wasn't concerned about my welfare. He was concerned about his commission and inheritance, and my emotional attachment to our family's foundation was just an inconvenience delaying his payday. Standing on the sidewalk outside my own home with 2 suitcases and nowhere to go, I felt smaller than I'd ever felt in 68 years of living. David's moving truck was already parked in the driveway, and workers were carrying out furniture that Martha and I had saved months to buy, memories being loaded into a vehicle like they were nothing more than inventory to be redistributed. My son barely looked at me as he supervised the removal of our family's entire history, occasionally barking orders about being careful with valuable pieces that would help stage the house for maximum sale price. Mrs. Eleanor Washington appeared at my side like an angel, taking one of my suitcases without being asked and wrapping her 75-year-old arm around my shoulders. "Robert Johnson, you're coming home with me until we figure this out," she said with the fierce determination of a woman who'd raised 6 children and buried 2 husbands. "That boy of yours ought to be ashamed, throwing his father out like trash, but he'll get what's coming to him. Mark my words." Her tiny guest room became my sanctuary, but sleeping in someone else's house while watching strangers tour my family home felt like living in a nightmare. David's real estate machine moved with brutal efficiency. Within 3 days, there was a "for sale" sign planted in Martha's flower garden, and by the weekend, a steady stream of young couples was tramping through rooms where my wife had cooked Sunday dinners and my son had done homework at the kitchen table. I could see them from Eleanor's front window, pointing and gesturing as they discussed their plans to modernize and open up the spaces where my family had lived and loved for 4 decades. The sale closed in just 2 weeks, bought by a tech worker from California who paid cash and planned to rent it out as an investment property. David pocketed a 6-figure commission plus the sale proceeds, immediately upgrading to a luxury SUV and taking a vacation to Miami to celebrate the successful transaction. Meanwhile, I was sleeping on a borrowed bed, watching my childhood home become someone else's rental property, while my son posted social media photos of himself drinking cocktails on a beach. James Wilson, the new tenant, was a decent young man who had no idea about the home's history or the circumstances of its sale. When he introduced himself over the fence, I couldn't bring myself to tell him that he was living in the house where I'd raised my family and cared for my dying wife. Instead, I just nodded politely and retreated to Eleanor's guest room, where I spent hours staring at the ceiling and wondering how a father could become so disposable to his own child. The humiliation went deeper than just losing my home. It was the realization that David had succeeded in making me feel like exactly what he'd called me, an old man with no purpose, no value, and no place in the modern world. My Social Security checks barely covered basic expenses. My savings had been depleted by Martha's medical bills, and at 68, I felt too old to start over but too young to give up. Every morning I'd sit on Eleanor's porch drinking coffee and watching life go on in the neighborhood where I no longer belonged. The lottery ticket I bought that Friday evening wasn't about hope or dreams. It was about having something to do with the $20 I found in an old jacket pocket. The corner store where I'd bought milk and bread for 40 years felt different now that I was just a visitor to my own neighborhood instead of a longtime resident. "Pick me a winner, Mr. Johnson," said Maria behind the counter. The same thing she'd said every time I'd bought a ticket over the years. I folded the ticket into my wallet without checking the numbers, too depressed to care about impossible dreams. 3 days after buying that lottery ticket with my last $20, I was sitting on Eleanor's porch drinking morning coffee when she handed me the newspaper and said, "Robert, You might want to check those numbers." I pulled the crumpled ticket from my wallet, expecting nothing. But as I matched each number against the winning combination, my hand started shaking so badly Eleanor had to take the paper and verify what I couldn't believe. 6 numbers had transformed me from a discarded old man into an $18 million lottery winner. And suddenly David's cruel words about living with old friends felt like prophecy instead of punishment. Eleanor's scream of joy brought half the neighborhood running to her porch, and within an hour, every person on Maple Street knew that the man David had thrown out like garbage was now richer than anyone in a 50-mile radius. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. The son who'd called his father worthless had just created the wealthiest man in the county. Mrs. Rodriguez from 3 houses down brought champagne. Mr. Pete started planning a block party, and everyone wanted to know what I was going to do with enough money to buy and sell David's real estate career 10 times over. My first call was to Tommy Chen, the estate planning attorney Eleanor's daughter had recommended. Tommy understood immediately what needed to happen: anonymous purchases through shell corporations, careful legal structuring to protect my privacy, and strategic timing to maximize the psychological impact of my revenge. "Mr. Johnson, we can buy every property on this street without anyone knowing you're the purchaser until you're ready to reveal yourself," he explained. "Your son kicked out a poor old man, but he's about to discover he displaced a real estate mogul. The plan we developed was beautifully simple: systematically purchase every house on Maple Street through different investment companies, with Tommy's firm handling all transactions to maintain anonymity. The timing was perfect because gentrification had created a seller's market, where homeowners were eager to cash out at premium prices. Within 6 weeks, I'd quietly acquired 12 of the 15 houses on our block, including the corner property that David had been eyeing for his own investment portfolio. James Wilson, my family home's new tenant, became an unwitting part of the plan when I instructed Tommy to purchase his rental property and offer him a lease renewal at the same rate. James had no idea his new landlord was the old man he'd seen sitting sadly on Eleanor's porch, just as David had no idea that his useless father now controlled more real estate than David had sold in his entire career. The house where I'd raised my son was now part of my empire, bought with money David could never have imagined his father possessing. Eleanor was my only confidant during those secret purchasing weeks, helping me choose which properties to buy and watching David's social media posts about his successful real estate deals, while knowing his father was quietly assembling a monopoly that would make David's commissions look like pocket change. "That boy thinks he's so smart," Eleanor would say, shaking her head as we watched David's luxury SUV drive past properties I now owned. "Just wait until he finds out who's really running this neighborhood." The final piece of my plan involved purchasing the empty lot at the end of Maple Street, where David had planned to build his dream house. He'd been saving and scheming for years to buy that lot, telling anyone who'd listen about his vision for a custom home that would establish him as the neighborhood's most successful resident. Instead, I bought it for cash through another shell company, ensuring that David's dreams of dominating our street would never materialize. By the end of 2 months, I owned 13 of the 15 houses on Maple Street, controlled the rental market, and had enough cash left over to maintain the properties better than they'd ever been maintained. The neighborhood where David had made me feel worthless and unwanted was now my personal kingdom, and the son who'd told me to go live with old friends was about to discover that sometimes old friends have more power than young fools could ever imagine. The moment I'd been planning for 3 months finally arrived when David called me for the first time since he'd kicked me out, his voice tight with frustration and confusion. "Dad, something weird is happening in your old neighborhood. Every house is being bought by investment companies, and I can't figure out who's behind it. The lot I wanted for my dream house just sold to some corporation I've never heard of." I almost smiled listening to my son puzzle over the real estate mystery that was destroying his plans while sitting in Eleanor's guest room, surrounded by property deeds bearing my name. Tommy Chen had orchestrated the revelation perfectly. Instead of telling David directly, we let him discover the truth through his own investigation into who was systematically purchasing every property on Maple Street. David's real estate connections led him to shell company after shell company, each one eventually tracing back to a trust controlled by Robert Johnson, the same useless old man he'd thrown out for being too worthless to deserve his own home. The phone rang again that evening, and this time David's voice was different, smaller, uncertain. with none of the arrogant confidence he'd displayed while stealing my house. "Dad, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me. Did you win some kind of lottery or something? Because there are legal documents here that show you own half the neighborhood, including the house where I grew up." The satisfaction of hearing my son's confusion was sweeter than any revenge I could have imagined. I let David squirm for a full minute before responding. "Yes, son. Turns out those old friends you told me to live with include Lady Luck, who decided an old man deserved better treatment than his own child provided." I explained how his cruelty had driven me to buy a lottery ticket with my last $20, and how that ticket had given me enough money to purchase the entire street where he'd made me feel homeless and worthless. The silence on David's end stretched so long I thought the call had dropped. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely a whisper. "Dad, you own my house? You own the whole street?" The reality was sinking in that the father he'd discarded as financially useless now controlled more wealth and property than David could accumulate in 10 lifetimes of real estate commissions. The son who'd told his father to find somewhere else to live was about to discover that somewhere else was everywhere. David's next question revealed exactly who he really was. "How much did you win? Can we split it? I mean, I am your son, and I helped you understand that keeping the old house wasn't practical." Even faced with evidence of his father's miraculous fortune, David's first instinct wasn't remorse or apology. It was calculating how he could profit from the situation. The boy I'd raised to value integrity was showing me once again that his moral compass pointed toward money rather than family. But the most delicious moment came when I told David about my plans for our old family home. "I've decided to move back into the house where I raised you, son. James Wilson is a good tenant, but I think I'd like to live in my own property again. Don't worry. I'll make sure you can visit as long as you call first and wipe your feet before coming into my house." The power dynamic had completely reversed. The father David had made homeless was now his landlord, and the house David had sold for profit was back in the hands of the man who'd truly earned it. Tommy Chen arrived that evening with a bottle of champagne and a folder full of documents showing the extent of my real estate empire. "Mr. Johnson, you now own 13 of the 15 houses on Maple Street, plus the empty lot your son wanted, plus 3 commercial properties downtown that were part of package deals. You've gone from homeless to housing magnate in less than 6 months." The transformation felt surreal, but the weight of those property deeds in my hands felt more solid than any revenge fantasy I could have imagined. 6 months after moving back into my family home, I was sitting on the front porch where Martha and I used to watch sunsets, drinking coffee from the same mug I'd used for 20 years, while David's luxury SUV pulled into what used to be his childhood driveway. My son had requested this meeting to discuss our family situation, but what he really wanted was to understand how his discarded father had become the most powerful property owner in the county. The irony of him having to ask permission to visit the house where he'd grown up wasn't lost on either of us. David's transformation from arrogant real estate agent to humbled son seeking reconciliation would have been touching if it weren't so obviously motivated by self-interest. He'd lost 3 major clients who discovered he'd thrown his own father out of his family home, and his reputation in Atlanta's tight-knit real estate community had suffered when word spread about his treatment of an elderly parent. "Dad, I want to apologize for how I handled things after Mom died," he said, but his eyes kept darting to the property deeds visible on my coffee table. I was grieving too, and I made some poor decisions. The neighborhood had been transformed under my ownership in ways that showcased what caring stewardship could accomplish. Every house was properly maintained, rents were kept affordable for longtime residents, and the sense of community that David's gentrification plans would have destroyed was stronger than ever. Mrs. Washington had moved back into her own home as my tenant, Mr. Pete's house had been renovated to accommodate his wheelchair, and James Wilson had become my property manager, handling day-to-day operations with more integrity than David had ever shown. Eleanor and I had become the unofficial mayors of Maple Street, hosting block parties in the park I'd built on the empty lot David had wanted for his dream house. The community garden where Martha's favorite flowers bloomed year-round had become a gathering place for neighbors who now felt secure in their homes thanks to my commitment to long-term, affordable housing. The street where David had tried to extract maximum profit had become a model for how neighborhoods could thrive when owned by someone who valued people over profits. David's attempts to repair our relationship were complicated by his obvious resentment of my newfound power and wealth. He'd bring flowers and apologies, but I could see him calculating the value of my property empire and wondering how much inheritance remained after my real estate investments. "I've learned a lot about what's really important," he'd say, but his questions always circled back to my financial plans and whether I'd considered expanding into commercial development where his expertise might be useful. The sweetest moment of my revenge came when David's former client, the tech worker who'd bought our family home, decided to sell and move back to California. David called to ask if I'd consider selling the property so he could handle the transaction and help restore the house to someone who'd appreciate its history. I told him I'd already decided to keep the house as a rental property managed by James Wilson, whose respect for our family's memories made him a better caretaker than my own son had ever been. Tommy Chen helped me establish the Martha Johnson Memorial Foundation, using lottery winnings to provide down payment assistance for working families who wanted to buy homes in stable neighborhoods. The foundation's first project was purchasing and renovating houses for families David had tried to displace during his gentrification schemes. My wife's legacy became about creating the kind of community stability that our son had been willing to destroy for commission checks and quick profits. Looking back on this whole experience, I realized David had actually given me the greatest gift of my life by showing me his true character before I died. His cruelty forced me to buy that lottery ticket. His greed motivated me to build a real estate empire. And his selfishness taught me that blood relations don't guarantee family loyalty. The son who told me to go live with old friends helped me discover that sometimes the universe provides exactly the friends you need, exactly when you need them most. Have you ever had family members treat you like you were worthless only to discover your own hidden strength? Have you experienced the sweet satisfaction of proving wrong people who underestimated your value? Share your story in the comments below. I'd love to hear about your own moments of unexpected triumph over people who counted you out too early. And don't forget to subscribe to Grandpa's Diaries for more tales about karma, family justice, and the amazing ways life can surprise us when we least expect it.